Ever tried to pull live data into Power Apps and hit a wall? You're not alone. Most Power Apps only talk to Microsoft services or a handful of open APIs. So, how do you make your business system part of the conversation? Today, we're walking through the exact steps for building a custom connector that securely links your app to any API, including those with tricky authentication. By the end, you'll be able to make Power Apps do much more than you thought possible. Why Power Apps hit a wall with external data. If you've ever tried to pull inventory or order data straight from your vendor's API, it can feel a bit like trying to tune in a radio and only getting static. Power Apps loves anything Microsoft, Exchange, SharePoint, SQL in Azure, you name it. Setting up a connection to your favorite Office 365 mailbox happens in seconds. But moment you step off the Microsoft path and try to reach into, let's say, a decades-old ERP or an industry-specific quoting system, things don't exactly just work. Power Apps offers a long list of connectors right out of the gate, hundreds if you scroll long enough. But if you're hoping to see your industry tool or your partner's custom database, you're probably out of luck. The built-ins mostly wrap up the popular cloud apps, a scattering of social networks, and a few general web hooks. Now, it's tempting to think, okay, so I'll just grab the REST API URL and plug it in. But here's where the real headaches begin. You realize most of your line of business data, the information that actually drives your processes, sits outside of Microsoft 365. Sometimes it lives in legacy systems so old the original developer has long since retired. Sometimes it's stuck in a new vendor tool that changes APIs every 6 months. Either way, you're staring at a connector list that barely scratches the surface of what you need. Think about the average business. Most teams have at least one homegrown app or legacy platform sitting under someone's desk, shipping, invoicing, ticketing, something that grew up around the way your business works. None of these show up when you hit add data. Even the systems that do appear often offer shallow integration. Maybe you can pull in a couple of fields, but not the full context or workflow you need. You start to realize that for anything outside the Microsoft bubble, you're on your own. And just to rub it in, security and authentication end up front and center, usually at the worst possible moment. Many external APIs use authentication schemes that look nothing like Microsoft's. OAuth 2.0, OpenID Connect, signed tokens, or the occasional API key buried in the docs. You might even stumble across proprietary one-off login flows that don't match any standard. The default connectors can't walk you through this mess. They assume you've got the right keys and tokens, and none of it is plug and play. This is right about when a lot of Power Apps and Power Automate projects hit the brakes. Not because the API is down or because the data can't be made available, but because the integration part gets complicated fast. The architecture behind connectors is a bit of a black box unless you're ready to dig into documentation. You realize every connector behind the scenes is a sort of pipeline, a bridge that handles requests, maps data, makes sense of logins, and masquerades as you. If anything breaks along the way, maybe you use the wrong token or an endpoint isn't defined correctly, you get errors that don't always point to the actual problem. Here's what that looks like in practice. Meet April, a supply chain manager. Every morning, she logs into her vendor's portal, manually exports yesterday's stock levels as a CSV, and then imports that file into a Power Apps dashboard so her team can see what's in stock and what needs to be reordered. It's basic copy and paste automation. In other words, not really automation at all. April's company pays for Power Platform, but without a connector to their inventory system, her team spends more time moving files than making decisions. It's a problem that never makes the roadmap because it looks like just a manual step when it's actually a huge source of wasted time. What makes this even more frustrating is that the data you want is right there behind a login or an API endpoint, but the standard Power Apps experience can't touch it. You're missing a way to securely hook your app up to any outside source, whether it's a cloud API with strict authentication or an on-premises app hiding behind a firewall. Built-in connectors only make it so far. They're great for what's popular, but they don't solve for the real variety of business tools you rely on every day. So what's missing? Direct, secure, and reliable access to data that sits outside Microsoft's walls. Without that, Power Apps does all the front-end work, beautiful forms, mobile interfaces, dashboards, but leaves your team wrestling with clunky imports and emails behind the scenes. The reality is your app can only ever be as smart as the data you feed it. And unless you know how to build the missing bridge between the Power Platform and your critical data, you're getting half the solution at best. If you've ever stared at an API doc, unsure where to begin, or if you've had a project stall because no connector exists for what you actually need, you're not alone. But there is a way through it. So what does it actually take to get Power Apps talking to any API, even when everything out of the box falls short? That's where custom connectors come in, and that's what we're jumping into next. What is a custom connector, and why should you care? If you're staring at an app that works fine with SharePoint, but draws a blank when you try to connect it to your critical supply chain data, you'll start to wonder what exactly makes a custom connector worth the trouble. Out of the box, Microsoft gives you a buffet of connectors. If your API isn't on the menu, you're left hungry. What a custom connector does differently is act as the missing piece that sits between Power Apps and any system with an API. It's not just another web form full of mysterious fields. It's your way to teach Power Platform how to speak someone else's language, no waiting for Microsoft to get around to it. Let's break it down. Custom connectors don't live in some magic corner of Power Platform. They work by taking the API endpoints your business actually cares about and translating them into actions, triggers, and data objects Power Apps understands. When you open up the custom connector wizard, you're not just mapping columns or picking a few checkboxes. You're giving Power Apps instructions. Here's how to talk to this system. Here's how you prove who you are. Here's what a good response looks like. Here's how to handle errors. Think of it like training an intern to handle all your calls to that old ERP. You're making sure nothing gets lost between what Power Apps sends and what the API expects in return. Some folks assume a custom connector is a one-click solution, but it's closer to building a reliable translator. You define every action, pulling customer data, creating orders, syncing inventory, by mapping each API endpoint to a named method in the connector. If your business needs to trigger something when a shipment arrives or update a record in the moment, you configure those triggers inside the connector. And security isn't something you shoehorn in at the end. You handle authentication upfront, API keys, OAuth 2.0 tokens, whatever hoops your external service makes you jump through. The difference is you decide exactly how the handshake works. Picture it as the universal adapter you throw in your bag before heading to a country with strange outlets. That's what the custom connector does for data. No matter what weird format your partner's API uses, JSON, XML, or something stranger, you can shape those payloads so Power Apps and Power Automate just get it. This isn't hypothetical. Over 70% of enterprise data doesn't live inside Microsoft 365. It sits in databases, on-prem apps, and cloud platforms nobody in Redmond has even heard of. Custom connectors are what break down that wall, letting you unlock the systems that really drive business day to day. Built-in connectors do their job, but they're locked into the way Microsoft predicts you'll want to connect. Try to stretch them, and it's a struggle. Lack of custom operations, no way to tweak authentication flows, zero support for industry-specific endpoints. With a custom connector, you build exactly what you need, no more and no less. It's how you go from we're stuck waiting on someone else's roadmap to we rolled out that new integration in a weekend. You stop being a passenger and start steering the integration process yourself. The contrast becomes obvious the first time you face a gap. Maybe there's a new compliance platform you need to monitor, or your team wants to roll out a customer-facing app with live order tracking. You check the Power Apps connector list. Nothing. You file a ticket with Microsoft, 6 months go by with no answer. Meanwhile, the competitor across town runs their own connector in just a few days because their IT team wrote it themselves. You see this all the time in real projects. The business that waits on a vendor is still exporting CSVs, and the business that builds a custom connector is busy building new workflows and dashboards. Custom connectors aren't a hack, and they're not the approach you take when you're desperate. They're a smart, forward-looking way to open up agility inside your business. Once the connector is built, it becomes a reusable building block for every app, every flow, every dashboard that needs that outside data. You unlock time for your users, you speed up reporting, you gain control over how and when updates happen. It moves you past the limitations of canned connectors and puts your business in the driver's seat. All of this sounds great, but let's be honest, building a connector means stepping into an architect's shoes, even if just for a few hours. There's more to it than clicking next and guessing your way through text fields. So what actually goes into building a connector that works for your needs? We're about to map out the real steps, from picking through API docs to wiring up your own action buttons and authentication. Let's get into how the pieces really come together. step by step, from API docs to a working custom connector. If you're looking to get a real-time inventory into Power Apps from a vendor system, you're not coding a new app from scratch. You're staring at an API reference that might as well be written for robots, not humans. So how do you bridge that gap? Let's walk through it, because that stack of API docs on your desk isn't doing much until you turn it into a working connector. Take a typical scenario. Your company partners with a specialized logistics provider. Their platform runs everything from shipment confirmations to up-to-the-minute stock levels. Great, they offer an API. Less great, the documentation looks like someone's copy-paste job from 2017. And now you're tasked with pulling daily inventory live into Power Apps, so your warehouse team isn't flying blind. You can't find an existing connector. The built-in ones don't cover this. It's up to you. First, you need to figure out what matters in those docs. Don't skim. Which endpoints actually drive value for your app? In this case, maybe there's a get endpoint for inventory that returns everything you need, or perhaps you need to hit shipments for status updates. The urge is to map every endpoint you find, but resist. Pick the ones your scenario really needs. You want focus, not bloat. Now comes the technical bit. Power Platform's custom connector wizard doesn't steer for you. It'll ask for an API definition, ideally in OpenAPI Swagger format. If your vendor provides an OpenAPI JSON, you've won the lottery. Drop it in, and the wizard sucks in all those endpoints into a neat list. But if they don't, you're building the definition yourself, translating cryptic endpoints, methods, required headers, and query parameters. One wrong character and nothing works. You'll start mapping each key operation in your app, define actions like get inventory, create shipment, and maybe custom triggers if you want your connector to run flows when a delivery is logged. There's no denying it. Most API docs gloss over authentication or throw out jargon like OAuth 2.0 and client credentials, as if everyone set up identity servers for fun. This part trips up even seasoned admins. Some APIs keep it simple, a static API key in the header. Others want you to register an app, handle client secrets, redirect URIs, and token endpoints. Get just one field wrong and your connector fails silently. Imagine thinking your app works, but all you see is blank data because your token expired or your scopes were off by a single character. The Power Platform wizard tries to help, but it won't verify your setup. For OAuth 2.0, you'll input the authorization URL, token endpoint, and scope fields it needs. You'll be asked for how your connector should prompt users to sign in, single sign-on for simplicity, or user-specific credentials if access needs to be granular. There's always the lingering doubt. Have I mapped this right? Or did I just put my connector on life support? My advice, test in isolation before letting anyone touch the app. Hit each action or trigger one by one. Watch how the API responds. If you get cryptic error messages, check the headers and authentication steps first. A good chunk of failed connectors aren't broken, they're just not getting proper authorization. Formatting requests and responses can be a headache too. Vendors love sending back sprawling JSON blobs or deeply nested arrays. Power Platform gives you tools to shape those responses, define sample payloads, and map outputs to logical fields your app can easily use. Sometimes you'll need a quick test using Postman or curl before locking down the request and response formatting in the connector definition. If you ignore what the API expects and don't handle optional versus required values, your action may fail with unhelpful messages. So read carefully, cleanly define your required inputs, and shape your outputs so they're usable for your end users. One of the most common pitfalls I see is authentication misfires. It's almost a ritual at this point. Someone creates the connector, wires up the app, and everything works when logged in as the builder. But hand it off to another user and boom, silent failures, errors buried in logs, or just a dashboard that never loads new data. The root cause: token scopes set too tightly, expired secrets, wrong permission assignments, or a missing callback URL in the connector settings. If your connector depends on OAuth or rotating tokens, automate renewal where you can, and watch for the early warning signs of failure. A good connector is all about small, repeated wins. Get one endpoint working, test the handshake, refine the error messages, then move on. Before long, you've built a bridge Power Apps can walk over every day. You can now refresh live inventory, update orders, or check delivery status with 0 manual steps. Suddenly, those dusty API docs have turned into new power for your business users. Keep in mind, wiring up endpoints is only half the story. Performance, error handling, and scaling to more users, All bring their own surprises, and not every team is ready for what comes next. Getting the connector running is step one. Making sure it works for everyone every time is step two. And that's where real world projects either soar or stall. Let's talk about where most teams run aground and what to watch for if you want to turn your connector into something the whole company can rely on. Pitfalls, lessons, and real world wins. You finally have a custom connector wired up and working in dev. Everyone's excited until the first sign of trouble. The sad truth is, more projects run into issues here than most teams want to admit. And it usually isn't the logic behind your endpoints that brings everything to a standstill. It's basic things like failing to keep track of authentication, ignoring what happens when something goes wrong, or pushing out a connector without even thinking about who else might use it. Suddenly that shiny new integration that worked for you falls flat when someone else tries it on their laptop or a production environment. One mistake that keeps showing up is confusing how authentication really works. It's easy to get a connector working while logged in as yourself. The OAuth 2.0 handshake completes, data flows in, everyone cheers. But skip the part where you map out refresh tokens or let secrets expire and the connector quietly stops pulling data. Maybe your inventory numbers lag a day behind, or maybe stockouts go unnoticed until a customer calls. This isn't just theory. I've seen a company automate a daily inventory pull to feed dashboards used by the sales team. For weeks, everything ran smoothly. Then, out of nowhere, the dashboards froze with yesterday's data. The root cause? They forgot to set up OAuth token refresh in their connector. The token expired, the requests started failing, and nobody got an alert. These silent outages create chaos. By the time anyone notices, people are making decisions based on stale data. Error handling is the next landmine. By default, Power Apps and Power Automate don't always show detailed failure messages back to end users. If your connector is set up to simply pass errors through, the business ends up with cryptic codes or even blank screens. Most people give up after the first bad gateway message, never realizing a minor change to error responses could have saved hours of troubleshooting. Good design calls for handling these errors, mapping them into clear messages, and showing the right information to the right people. Otherwise, your connector works great until it doesn't, and nobody can tell why. Security best practices get ignored in the rush to finish. You see connectors with overly broad permissions, API keys hard-coded in files, or every user getting the same access level for testing. These shortcuts open the door to leaks or accidental changes in production. Eventually, a connector that worked fine in isolation becomes a security risk the second more people start using it. Microsoft MVPs and architects point out that treating connectors like one-user prototypes is a sure way to build technical debt. When you roll out to a wider team, you have to consider scope, who gets to connect, what data they see, and how to audit what's happening in the background. It doesn't matter how solid your connector seems in testing if you can't vouch for security and privacy across the board. Most failures don't come from bad code. They come from skipping documentation or blast deploying to production. One team I worked with tied their entire purchasing system to an API integration and ran it as is after launch. When the vendor switched a URL endpoint, nothing in production worked, but nobody knew why. No tests were automated. There was no documentation about which triggers mattered. It took days to chase down the issue when a clear change log and a test connector could have flagged it in minutes. Teams that spend that little bit of extra time writing down which operations matter, using separate test environments, and looping in API owners early tend to avoid these headaches entirely. It's tempting to think if it works once, it'll always work. This is what MVPs call happy path testing. You make a few calls, see your data come through, and assume you're done. In the real world, integration points change. An authentication certificate might expire on a Friday night. A required field could get renamed in the next API version. Each time the connector goes quiet unless you've planned for the unexpected. Monitoring helps, but so does documentation. The best teams schedule regular reviews, run checks against backup endpoints, and keep credentials fresh. Automation kicks in, flagging anomalies or failed jobs before users notice. This mindset turns a custom connector from a one-off experiment into a business asset everyone relies on. Picture the flip side, a team that preemptively maps out error responses, runs test flows on a schedule, and keeps clear API credentials stored securely in Azure Key Vault. Updates get previewed in a test tenant before production sees them. New triggers and endpoints are documented so future admins know the why as well as the how. It's not glamour work, But when a supplier changes their API without warning, this team patches the connector in minutes, not days. Real-world wins don't come from luck. They come from building for resilience. Connectors that work for everyone, not just the admin who set them up, get monitored, tested, and documented the whole way through. That's how organizations end up with integrations that drive value well beyond the first deployment, turning connectors into assets, not liabilities. If you're ready to get more from your Power Apps, knowing how to steer around these pitfalls turns that connector into the backbone of something bigger. So now that you have the lay of the land and know the traps to avoid, let's consider where your Power Apps journey could head next and how these custom connectors make that possible. If your Power Apps aren't connected to the data that actually powers your business, you're leaving both time and value on the table. The connectors Microsoft provides get you started, but the real shift happens when you can hook into those niche APIs and old business systems your teams use every day. Start by grabbing one critical process, open up that API documentation, and build something small that solves a real headache. Custom connectors are how you stop exporting spreadsheets and start moving faster. As Power Platform keeps evolving, knowing this skill will put you ahead every time a new challenge lands.